Thomas Miller stood in silence at the corner of his penthouse office, the Chicago skyline stretching before him in streaks of gold and orange as the sun began to set. He had always loved this time of day, a moment of stillness, of reflection, a rare pause in an otherwise relentless schedule. 25 years ago, with nothing more than a modest loan and a vision to do things differently, he founded Miller Automotive Group. What began as a single humble garage in a downtown alley had grown into an empire of 32 thriving dealerships across 3 states. People saw him as a symbol of success, of resilience, ambition, and American grit. But today, none of that comforted him. On the edge of his desk, next to an untouched cup of coffee, sat a stack of letters that had stolen his sleep for weeks. Each letter carried a weight heavier than the next. Anonymous complaints from staff concerning whispers from loyal customers and troubling rumors that his original dealership, his very first one, was falling apart at the seams. His flagship store on West Monroe Street, the one that carried his name and legacy, had become the epicenter of something rotten. The report spoke of employee mistreatment of talented workers being driven away by fear and manipulation. There were claims of fraudulent repairs, customers being charged for services never performed, and a work culture that had turned cold, ruthless, even predatory. All of it seemed to trace back to one name, Kyle Bennett. On paper, Kyle was everything a CEO could want, an Ivy League graduate with glowing references and a fast-rising career. Thomas had handpicked him to breathe new life into the original location. Instead, he now feared he had handed the keys to a wolf in sheep's clothing. He leaned forward and opened the final report from the private investigator he had hired, his fingers trembling slightly, though he would never admit it. As he scanned the pages, each paragraph confirmed what he had hoped was exaggeration or misunderstanding. It wasn't just bad leadership, it was systemic. Bullying, fear-based motivation, manipulated billing records, and a revolving door of good employees who left in silence. Even customers once loyal for decades had started drifting away, whispering among themselves that the service wasn't what it used to be. The very foundation of his brand, trust, transparency, and people-first ethics, was being dismantled brick by brick, all while Kyle posted record profits and boasted about quarterly growth. It wasn't growth, it was rot, painted gold. Melissa, his longtime assistant, knocked gently before entering the room. "The investigator's final file just arrived, sir," she said softly, as if sensing the storm building inside him. Thomas nodded, already, holding it in his hand. In all the years she had worked with him, Melissa had only seen him this quiet once when his father passed away. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. They both knew what this meant. A decision was forming, and when Thomas Miller got that certain look in his eyes, the one that mixed steel determination with an almost dangerous calm, something irreversible was about to happen. He turned from the window, his jaw set, his voice low and certain. "Cancel everything for the next 4 weeks. Meetings, trips, interviews, everything." Melissa blinked. "Everything." He nodded. "And get me Harold from HR. We're about to do something unconventional." Moments later, Harold sat across from Thomas, visibly confused, as the CEO laid out a bold and strange plan. "You want to?" what Harold asked, clearly thinking he had misheard. Thomas didn't flinch. "I want a new identity. I'm going undercover as a mechanic." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. "Sir, with all due respect, you're one of the most recognized faces in the industry. People know who you are. This isn't just risky, it's necessary." Thomas interrupted. "I built this company from the shop floor. If it's broken, I won't fix it from an ivory tower. I'll fix it where it started, with my own 2 hands." That night, long after the office had emptied and the city lights flickered below, Thomas remained at his desk, staring at a faded photo of the original team from the very first dealership. They looked so proud, so full of hope, back when names mattered more than numbers and handshakes meant something. He had always promised himself he'd never lose sight of that, and maybe somewhere along the way he had, but this was his second chance. not just to protect the company, but to rediscover it. Whatever darkness had taken root inside his legacy, Thomas Miller was about to walk into it himself, not as the CEO, but as a man who still believed that integrity wasn't just good business, it was everything. It took nearly 2 weeks to erase Thomas Miller, the confident CEO in tailored suits, polished wingtips, and the crisp aura of boardroom authority, and replace him with Greg Walker, a man the world would barely glance at. Greg was 45 years old, recently divorced, and new to Chicago. He came from Ohio, where he'd worked in a handful of small-town garages, and by the looks of it, carried the weight of a man who had long since stopped caring what people thought of him. His shoulders slumped slightly from years of hard labor. His midsection was padded with 40 pounds of carefully distributed foam, and his hands, thanks to the work of a theatrical makeup artist, were rough-calloused and marked with grease-stained knuckles. Even his beard, grayer and scruffier than Thomas's usual clean shave, looked aged and authentic. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic. It was a study in humility. Thomas had always believed in leading from the front, but now he was going to lead from the bottom, anonymously, and with no safety net. Melissa had coordinated the logistics flawlessly. A fake resume had been created under the name Greg Walker, complete with employment history at small garages that no longer existed, and references that would check out thanks to Harold's behind-the-scenes coordination. A local DMV contact ensured that Greg's ID and background passed any HR scrutiny. The garage where he'd be working his own flagship dealership had been told that Greg was a late transfer from a partner program, a blue-collar guy trying to restart life after a messy divorce. Nothing special. No reason to pay too much attention. That was the point. The best way to observe the truth was to become invisible in plain sight. On the morning of his first day, Thomas stood in front of his bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. The thick-rimmed glasses hid his sharp blue eyes, his belly sagged under the mechanic's coveralls, and his once confident posture had been traded for a slight stoop. Even his voice had changed now, gravelly with a faint Ohio accent that he'd practiced for hours. He wasn't Thomas anymore. He was Greg, a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. As he buttoned up the uniform, a sense of unease gripped him, not fear but humility. For the first time in decades, no one would call him sir. No one would hold open doors or defer to his opinion. He was about to become one of the workers his company depended on, but had perhaps unknowingly overlooked. The drive to the dealership was surreal. Instead of the sleek black Mercedes he usually drove, Thomas slid behind the wheel of a beat-up 2010 Honda Civic, its paint faded, its muffler rattling faintly as he pulled into the employee lot behind the building. No reserved parking, no valet, just cracked pavement and the soft crunch of gravel under old tires. He sat in the car for a long minute, staring at the garage he had once poured his soul into. It looked the same on the outside, clean, corporate, and efficient. But now he knew, thanks to the investigation, that rot had grown beneath that polished surface. As he stepped out and adjusted the straps of his padded suit beneath the coveralls, he told himself this was more than an undercover mission. This was a reckoning. The moment Greg walked into the service department, he felt the shift in atmosphere. Gone were the cheerful greetings and respectful nods he once received as Thomas. In their place were skeptical glances, forced nods, and muttered questions. A few mechanics barely looked up. The receptionist, clearly overwhelmed, glanced at him and gestured toward the back office without even asking his name. "New guys here," someone called. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming either, just cold. Transactional. When Kyle Bennett finally emerged, he was exactly as Thomas remembered from the investigators' photos, early 30s, slim, stylish, and wearing a designer watch that clashed with his blue-collar surroundings. He barely looked at Greg as he flipped through a folder. "Greg Walker," he muttered. "Transferred in from Ohio or whatever. You eat more than you work or what?" The comment landed like a slap, but Thomas now. Greg just nodded meekly. He was here to observe, not to fight. And clearly the show had already begun. As Kyle strutted back toward the garage, he barked orders over his shoulder without looking back. You'll be on oil changes and tire rotations until we see you're not completely useless. Don't touch anything expensive." Thomas followed quietly, heart pounding. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that his once proud shop had become a place where cruelty was currency. He passed familiar equipment, worn workbenches, and posters he himself had approved years ago. None of it felt like home anymore. The faces were new, but the energy was undeniable, tense, robotic, and devoid of joy. No one smiled, no one cracked a joke. It was as if they were all waiting for the next verbal blow, the next humiliation. And so, Greg Walker, the overweight, broken-down mechanic, took his place among them, not as their boss, but as their equal, at least for now. The smell of motor oil and burnt rubber lingered in the air as Greg Walker stepped into the service bay, his coveralls slightly too snug around the belly, his boots scuffed to perfection. It was his first official hour on the job, but already he could feel the weight of eyes tracking his every move, not out of curiosity, but judgment. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly as Kyle Bennett entered the garage, hands shoved into his slim-fit slacks, his Rolex glinting with every step. Kyle's presence seemed to command an invisible pressure that settled over the crew like a fog. Conversations died mid-sentence, tools were hastily set down, and everyone became unnaturally focused on whatever was directly in front of them. No one looked up. No one greeted their new co-worker. Kyle's eyes landed on Greg. No smile, no handshake. Just a once-over that started at the boots and ended at the barely buttoned collar. "So you're Walker," he said, smirking. "They really sent us a heavy hitter, huh?" He gave a theatrical chuckle loud enough for everyone to hear. "What did you do before this run a donut shop out of your trunk?" Laughter didn't follow, but the silence that replaced it was worse. It was the kind of silence born from fear, the kind where people don't laugh because they think something's funny, but because they're too scared not to. Greg felt his jaw tighten under the fake beard, but he stayed in character. "Just here to work, sir," he said with a nod, keeping his voice low and unthreatening. Kyle narrowed his eyes, disappointed that his jab hadn't provoked more of a reaction. "Yeah, we'll see how long that lasts." Without another word, Kyle motioned toward a puddle of oil near Bay 3. "Clean that up before someone sues us. Try not to slip and bring the whole place down with you." The words were casual, but the tone carried something sharper. Cruelty disguised as humor. Greg walked toward the spill, slowly carrying a mop bucket that was dented and half empty. The task itself didn't bother him. What did was the way everyone else in the garage pretended not to notice. Not one of the mechanics looked in his direction. Even when he passed by their stations, heads remained down, eyes fixed on engine blocks or brake pads. It wasn't just awkwardness, it was survival. A carefully learned behavior: don't make eye contact, don't speak unless spoken to, and above all, never show empathy toward the newest target. Greg knelt by the oil spill and began to clean methodically, soaking up the slick mess while keeping his ears open. From this vantage point, he could observe the subtle rhythms of the team. There was Alex, maybe early 20s, working too quickly on a brake caliper job, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds as if waiting to be reprimanded. There was Dennis, a graying veteran, moving slower, more deliberate, but with eyes that seemed dulled by repetition. And then there was Claire, the service advisor, rushing through papers at the front desk. Her blazer wrinkled, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Each person moved like they were walking on glass, trying not to attract Kyle's attention and praying that someone else would become his next target. As Greg reached for more absorbent cloths, he noticed Kyle walk up to Dennis. "What's taking so long on the alternator swap?" Kyle barked. Trying to remember how to use a wrench, Dennis didn't respond right away, just gave a tight nod and returned to his work. "You've got a week, maybe 2, Kyle muttered under his breath, but loud enough for others to hear. "Retirement's looking real good. Right about now, isn't it?" It wasn't leadership. It was bullying. Camouflaged beneath numbers and deadlines, but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever had to endure it. Greg clenched his fist inside the mop glove, the urge to speak burning on the edge of his tongue, but he reminded himself he wasn't here to confront, not yet. He was here to understand how deep the rot went. By lunch, the hierarchy of fear had been made crystal clear. Kyle barked. The team flinched. He insulted. They nodded. The few attempts Greg made to connect with the others, a quick, "Hey, how long you been here?" or "Need a hand with that?" were met with polite, tight-lipped replies and quick glances toward the office window where Kyle often watched with a predator's gaze. No one dared be seen as friendly with the new guy, not if they wanted to keep their jobs, and so Greg sat alone at the end of the break room table, chewing on a bland sandwich, observing the people he once thought he understood. But what he saw wasn't laziness or incompetence, it was survival. It was what happens when good employees are left to fend for themselves under bad leadership. As the afternoon wore on, Greg was given another assignment. Cleaning out the drainage near the back loading dock where grease and rainwater collected into a black sludge, Kyle handed him the task with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This one's special," he said. "Needs a guy with your build." More snickering. More glances that avoided contact. Greg took the tools without comment, walking slowly to the back. And as he knelt once again in the dirt and grime, scraping away at muck that had no business being left unattended, he realized something simple but devastating. This wasn't an isolated bad day. This was the culture now. This was what his flagship dealership had become under Kyle Bennett's rule, a place where shame replaced support, where silence replaced camaraderie, and where fear sat at every workstation like a second supervisor. And that more than the insults or the dirty jobs was the true humiliation of day one. By the end of his second day, Greg Walker had become a fixture in the background, someone no one questioned, but no one welcomed either. Kyle Bennett had a way of making you feel small without ever raising his voice. His sarcasm was constant, his insults expertly timed, always just loud enough for others to hear, but quiet enough to be excused as just joking. And when his words hit, they hit hard. "Hey, Walker," he called out across the garage one afternoon. "How's that back holding up? Might want to ask HR for forklift training next time you lift a wrench." The mechanics chuckled awkwardly, not because it was funny, because silence could be dangerous. Greg forced a smile and returned to his work, wiping sweat from his brow and swallowing the sting in his throat. He wasn't here to defend himself. He was here to see what they endured, and already the picture was becoming painfully clear. Each morning followed the same rhythm. Greg would show up early, hoping to find a few minutes of solitude before the storm rolled in. But by the time the clock hit 8:30, the atmosphere shifted. Eyes lowered, backs stiffened, and everyone braced themselves for another day under Kyle's rule. It was subtle, but suffocating. The garage didn't run on teamwork. It ran on tension. Veteran employees like Dennis, once the heart of the service department, now moved like ghosts. His hands were still steady, his instincts sharp, but the light behind his eyes had dimmed. Greg noticed how Dennis double-checked everything, not out of diligence, but fear. Every bolt, every form, every talk, spec-checked twice, then again. It wasn't perfectionism, it was survival. Claire, the lead service advisor, fared no better. Her desk, once a hub of organization, and customer care now looked like a battlefield. Papers piled high. 2 monitors flickering with mismatched reports. Her fingers moved with robotic precision, but her face told a different story. Dark circles under her eyes, lines that hadn't been there before. Greg saw her one afternoon, hunched over a spreadsheet, whispering to herself, "These numbers don't match. They never match anymore." She wasn't sloppy. He remembered her from the early days. Claire used to be the kind of employee who sent customers home with handwritten thank you notes. Now she looked like she was hanging on by a thread, caught between keeping the books clean and keeping her conscience intact. But amid the pressure and the poisoned air, Greg found one quiet spark of humanity. Marco, a young mechanic, no older than 23, with quick hands and eyes that were always watching, always alert. Marco didn't speak much, but Greg could see the weight he carried. one afternoon while they were restocking parts. Marco hesitated, glancing around before whispering, "You're new, right? Just be careful. Don't let him catch you talking too much." Greg nodded, respecting the warning. He kept his voice low. "Been here long." Marco nodded. 3 years. Started right after tech school. Thought it'd be different. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken disappointment. Then, softly, Marco added, "My sister's sick cancer. I asked Kyle for a day off next week for her treatment. He said if I miss another day, I should look for work somewhere else." Greg's chest tightened. He knew the pain of watching someone you love suffer. He also knew what kind of man it took to deny a kid that kind of grace. "I'm sorry," he said genuinely. Marco just shrugged. "It's whatever, I gotta keep the job. Can't afford to piss him off." And with that, he returned to work faster than before, his hands slightly trembling as he worked on a brake job. Greg stayed behind, holding a box of filters, heart pounding not from anger, but from the unbearable knowledge that his company, his name, had become the backdrop for cruelty disguised as discipline. As the days unfolded, the dysfunction revealed itself like cracks in old concrete. Mechanics were pushed to upsell unnecessary services. Real issues were ignored if they weren't profitable. Breaks were shortened. Shifts extended, all under the guise of company standards. Kyle walked the floor like a king among peasants, snapping orders, criticizing loudly, praising rarely, and the staff, they obeyed. Not because they respected him, but because they were trapped. Some had families to support others. Like Marco had medical bills. Claire was probably too far into the system to walk away without risking everything she'd built. Even Dennis, whose retirement was long overdue, stayed silent, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of loyalty to a place that no longer existed. By the end of the week, Greg had learned more than any report could have told him. The numbers looked good because the people were afraid to speak. Kyle's dealership was profitable, not through leadership, but through coercion. And the saddest part, most of them had accepted it. They didn't complain. They didn't rebel. They just adapted, like animals in a storm that had no end in sight. But Greg had also seen something else, a glimmer of resilience. In Marco's quiet bravery, in Claire's exhausted but steady hands, in Dennis's commitment to doing things right, even when no one thanked him for it. That's what gave Greg hope, that beneath the rot, something good still lived here, something worth saving by the start of his second week. Greg Walker no longer needed to dig for answers. He was standing in the middle of them. The signs of corruption weren't just whispers behind closed doors. They were plastered across whiteboards, hidden in service forms, and echoed in every pressured conversation between mechanics and management. Kyle Bennett didn't just tolerate dishonesty, he orchestrated it. He wore the mask of a manager who knew how to drive profit, but underneath he was something else entirely, a salesman of fear, greed, and manipulation. Greg watched as Kyle floated through the garage each day with a smile that never reached his eyes, a clipboard under one arm and a fresh scheme under the other. His favorite tool wasn't a wrench, it was pressure. The first time Greg saw it happen up close, it involved an elderly woman with a soft voice and a faded blue cardigan. She brought in her well-maintained sedan for a routine oil change. Kyle intercepted her at the front counter, his tone syrupy sweet. "Mrs. Whitaker, thank you for coming in. We noticed something a bit concerning during the inspection. Your timing belt is nearly shot. If that goes, it could destroy the whole engine." We're talking thousands in repairs. Greg had personally looked at the car earlier that morning. The belt had been replaced less than 6 months ago. It was still in excellent condition, but Mrs. Whitaker didn't know that. She hesitated clearly, overwhelmed. "I don't know. I live on Social Security. Is it really necessary?" Kyle leaned in, lowering his voice like he was doing her a favor. "Tell you what, I'll give you our special care package, full synthetic oil, a fuel system, flush and belt replacement for just $2,999. I'd hate for you to get stranded somewhere." And just like that, the lie was sold. Greg watched jaw tight as Mrs. Whitaker signed the form with shaky hands and quietly handed over her checkbook. It wasn't just salesmanship. It was exploitation, and it wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next several days, Greg saw it again and again. Customers talked into expensive services. They didn't need repairs that were rushed or skipped parts that were marked up 3 times their actual value. If anyone dared to question it, Kyle's demeanor changed instantly. Friendly became icy. Calm became cruel. When Marco timidly asked if he could leave early one afternoon to drive his sister to a treatment appointment, Kyle cornered him near the stockroom. "You think I'm running a charity?" he hissed. "If you're not committed, I've got 10 guys who'd take your place tomorrow. You leave early, you're off the schedule next week." Try me, even Dennis, whose years of service should have earned him a voice, was silenced. One morning he noticed a markup on a standard brake job invoice. What should have cost the customer $249 was billed at nearly $700. When he mentioned the discrepancy, Kyle didn't miss a beat. "That's the new pricing structure. You got a problem with it?" Dennis tried to press, mentioning that it was inconsistent with company guidelines. Kyle leaned in. "You're close to retirement, right? Be a shame if your paperwork got held up due to performance issues. People make mistakes. Sometimes they don't get their full pension. Careful what you push." From that moment, Dennis said nothing, but Greg could see the anger simmering behind his quiet, resigned expression. Claire, meanwhile, bore the heaviest burden of them all. As the lead service advisor, she was responsible for reconciling work orders with parts inventory technician hours and customer billing. But the math never added up, not because she wasn't trying, but because Kyle had created a system designed to fail. "Adjust it," he'd say. "Just move the numbers, make it balance." Every day, Claire had to choose between doing what was right and keeping her job, so she created 2 sets of records, one for the books, one for the truth. She kept a separate spreadsheet hidden deep in her personal files, tracking overcharges, fake repairs, and parts that never existed. When Greg once casually asked if she was okay, she gave a half smile and said, "Depends on what version of the truth you want." It was in the break room that Greg finally saw her crack. She sat at the table alone, her laptop open, a half-eaten salad untouched beside her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, shaking slightly. "They don't match," she whispered. "Again. These numbers. They don't make sense. I've fixed them 6 times today." Her voice was frayed, her shoulders tense. Greg sat beside her, silently offering nothing but presence. It wasn't his role to fix it. Not yet. But watching someone so capable, so devoted, be forced into dishonesty by threat and exhaustion, it lit something inside him. A line had been crossed. This wasn't just unethical. It was abuse, and it was happening under the name he had built his life on. As that week came to a close, Greg no longer questioned whether the reports he'd received were exaggerated. If anything, they had been too gentle. This wasn't a case of poor management or underperformance. This was a toxic culture rooted in fear, greed, and calculated manipulation. Kyle Bennett wasn't just a bad hire, he was a dangerous one. And worse, he had turned good people into accomplices simply by forcing them to choose between their integrity and their livelihood. Greg had seen enough. He had the names, the receipts, the voices, trembling behind locked office doors, and in time he would bring it all into the light. But for now he tightened the straps on his padded suit, put on his fake smile, and returned to the garage, still just the fat, invisible mechanic who no one really noticed, because that's exactly who he needed to be. For now, late one Thursday morning, Greg was restocking filters near the parts counter when he heard the soft, familiar voice of Mrs. Henderson, a long-time customer in her 70s who'd been coming to the dealership since before the lobby had automatic doors. Her gentle smile and thick glasses were unmistakable, and she carried with her the quiet dignity of someone who still wrote checks, remembered birthdays, and baked cookies for the staff during the holidays. Today, however, she looked tense, clutching her handbag with both hands as she spoke with Kyle Bennett. Greg kept his back turned, pretending to organize inventory while tuning in to the conversation that quickly took a darker turn. Kyle's voice was smooth, too smooth. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, full of fake concern, "we've discovered a serious issue with your timing belt. It's beginning to fray. If that belt snaps while you're driving, it could destroy your entire engine. We're talking a full rebuild. Easily 25 grand. Greg's hands paused over a box of air filters. He had personally serviced Mrs. Henderson's car 6 months ago, back when he was still Thomas Miller. The timing belt had been brand new. He knew it. And yet, here was Kyle offering his signature preventive care package for a cool $3,000. It's the smart move. Kyle continued, and because we value your loyalty, I'll knock a couple hundred off if you sign today. Greg turned just enough to see her hand tremble as she pulled out her checkbook. Her eyes darted uncertainly across the service floor, looking for help that wasn't there. Greg's stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't just wrong, it was predatory. Watching Kyle exploit an elderly woman's trust with a lie that would pad his personal bonuses made Greg's blood boil. But still, he said nothing. He couldn't, not yet. Instead, he walked to the other side of the shop, heart-pounding hands shaking as he replayed Kyle's words in his mind. He wasn't just bending the truth, he was engineering a con. And Mrs. Henderson wasn't the first. She was just today's target. That afternoon, Greg found Marco sitting alone behind the garage, hunched over on an old tire, picking at the edge of his sandwich. The usual energy in his eyes was gone, replaced by something distant and hollow. Greg sat beside him, quietly waiting. Eventually, Marco spoke. I asked again. He said, voice barely audible. Told him my sister's appointment got moved and I needed the morning off. He shook his head. He laughed. Said, if I wanted to play nurse, I should do it on my own time. Said he can't count on someone who disappears every time there's a family emergency. Greg clenched his jaw, the words stinging like they'd been said to him personally. Marco looked up. I don't know what to do anymore. I'm already working weekends. I haven't had a full day off in 2 months. He paused. She's my sister. She's all I've got. Greg felt something settle in his chest, a quiet, burning resolve, the kind that didn't yell or slam fists, but gathered strength like a storm rolling in from the horizon. Enough was enough. These weren't isolated incidents or lapses in judgment. This was the daily reality at his flagship dealership, and it had Kyle's fingerprints all over it. Every manipulative upsell, every denied request, every quiet resignation of good people. Too scared to fight back. It all led to one source. And Greg, still hidden behind his padded suit and fake name, was starting to collect more than just observations. He was gathering proof. Later that evening, the garage began to empty. Mechanics packed up, lights dimmed, and the hum of equipment gave way to silence. Greg lingered behind, pretending to finish inventory, while he kept one eye on Kyle's office at 6:42 p.m. Kyle stepped out briefly to take a call near the loading dock, leaving his office door ajar and his phone charging on the desk. Greg saw his chance. With deliberate calm, he slipped inside and glanced at the unlocked screen. What he found made his pulse race. A text notification had just popped up. The sender was listed only as B. The message read, payment received $50K. Parts arrive Friday. No labels. Greg's eyes narrowed. No labels. That meant counterfeit. Illegally sourced components meant to look like the real thing. It confirmed what he'd suspected for days, that Kyle wasn't just pushing fake repairs, he was actively working with suppliers to import low-grade parts and pass them off as factory-issued. He snapped a quick photo of the message and slipped back out before Kyle returned. A few minutes later, Kyle walked past him without a word, unaware that the carefully constructed web he'd built was beginning to unravel. Greg didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the day's events playing over in his mind, like a film. He couldn't pause Mrs. Henderson's trembling hands, Marco's exhausted, quiet desperation. The message on Kyle's phone. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about ethics, about human decency, about whether Miller Automotive stood for something real or if it had become just another company where profit came first, people second. By morning, Greg had made a decision. He wasn't just going to expose Kyle. He was going to dismantle every lie, brick by brick, until the truth was undeniable and irreversible. But to do that, he needed more than anger. He needed strategy, patience, and the very thing that made him a great leader. Before any of this began, trust in the truth. By week 3, Greg Walker, once an invisible mechanic with grease-stained gloves and a limp in his step, had quietly become the dealership's most dangerous employee. Not because of any technical skill or confrontational attitude, but because every break he took, every lunch he skipped, was spent gathering something far more valuable than parts evidence. It had started with photos, quick snapshots taken when no one was looking. A mislabeled box of brake pads, a forged inspection report, a discarded invoice listing a repair that never happened. Each photo was saved, time-stamped, and backed up to an encrypted drive Greg kept hidden beneath the spare tire in his Civic. Then came the audio. Using a discreet voice recorder clipped inside the pocket of his coveralls, he captured conversations, Kyle mocking customers, threatening staff, and instructing Claire to clean up the numbers. Every laugh, every threat, every quiet moment of complicity was preserved piece by piece. It wasn't enough to know what was happening. Greg had to prove it. One misstep, one out-of-place file, and Kyle would sniff him out. So Greg became methodical. During his late shifts, when most of the crew had clocked out, he wandered through the shop with a rag in one hand and a phone camera in the other. He'd open drawers, flip through folders, and photograph purchase orders marked with supplier codes that didn't match the official vendor list. One night, while reorganizing oil filters, he discovered a false wall panel in the back stockroom. Behind it, crates of unmarked boxes filled with parts, brake pads, spark plugs, filters all unlabeled and stacked in neat rows like contraband. No serial numbers, no traceability. The implication was clear. These weren't just grey market goods, they were counterfeit, but the most damning discovery came on a rainy Wednesday evening. The shop was quiet. The storm outside had sent most customers home early, and Kyle predictably was pacing in his office, agitated. Greg pretended to be cleaning tools nearby when a black SUV pulled into the service bay, headlights cutting through the drizzle. Out stepped a man in a long coat with a clipboard tucked under his arm. It was Inspector Raymond Green from the District Automotive Board. Greg recognized him from a company-wide seminar 2 years ago. Kyle greeted him with an over-familiar handshake and a chuckle leading him toward the break room. Greg, careful not to be seen, slipped through the back hallway and positioned himself near the half-open door. What he heard turned his stomach. "We'll call this a courtesy visit," Kyle said, his voice low. "Same arrangement as last time." There was a pause, then the rustle of paper. Greg peered in just long enough to see Kyle slide a thick envelope across the table. Inspector Green didn't even blink. "You said the parts arrived Friday." Kyle nodded. Unmarked. No barcode. Same supplier. Green leaned back in his chair. "Just make sure Claire doesn't flag any of it on the records." Kyle grinned. "She knows better." Greg stepped back, heart pounding but his mind clear. He'd caught them, not just Kyle, but the system. This wasn't one rogue manager skimming profits. This was a Network A, supply chain of fraud, and now he had the smoking gun. After the inspector left, Greg waited until Kyle went to the restroom. He slipped into the break room and snapped a photo of the envelope, half open, still on the table. The edge of a bank transfer receipt poked out along with a signature. It wasn't just hush money, it was evidence of collusion between leadership and regulators. That night, back in the garage alone, Greg documented everything he had gathered so far. Photos of mismatched parts, duplicate service records, invoices with inflated prices, audio of Kyle mocking elderly customers and threatening employees like Marco, even security footage which he had quietly downloaded during a late-night network update showing Kyle moving boxes into the hidden storeroom. The scope of it all stunned him. This was no longer about saving one dealership. This was about protecting the entire Miller Automotive brand. Kyle hadn't just corrupted a team, he had poisoned the culture. He'd weaponized fear and greed, turning honest employees into silent accomplices and customers into unknowing victims. Greg thought of Marco's trembling hands, Claire's whispered spreadsheets, Dennis's tired eyes. He thought of every technician who had once taken pride in their work and now walked on eggshells. He had seen enough, but more importantly, he had captured enough. There could be no denial now, no internal audit buried in bureaucracy, no PR spin. When the moment came, and it would, Greg would be ready to pull back the curtain and expose everything. Still, he knew he had to be cautious. Kyle was getting paranoid. More than once, Greg caught him scanning the shop floor with narrowed eyes, hovering near computers, asking Claire if anyone had been snooping around the files. His arrogance remained intact, but there was a new edge to his voice, a crack in the mask. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know from where, and that gave Greg the final advantage. Every insult Kyle hurled, every underhanded deal he made, every fake smile he wore, it was all being logged, catalogued, prepared. For the day when truth would arrive, not as a whisper, but as a reckoning, and Greg, once just a shadow in the garage, would be the one holding the light. It was early Monday morning when the shouting started. The dealership had barely opened, the coffee in the break room still brewing, when a sharp voice cut through the quiet hum of the service bay. Greg looked up from restocking coolant just in time to see a young man and woman storm through the front doors. The man was tall, maybe in his late 20s, with tense shoulders and a mechanic's report clutched in one hand. The woman, holding a baby carrier with a sleeping infant, looked equally furious, her eyes wet but focused. "Where's the manager?" the man demanded. "We need to speak to someone." Now Claire tried to calm them, but they pushed past her. "This is about the brakes," he said louder. They failed. "On the highway with my wife and daughter in the car, and the shop that towed us said, 'Your parts were counterfeit.'" Greg stepped out from behind the tool shelf, watching from a distance as the scene unfolded. Kyle appeared a moment later, smoothing his tie with that polished, condescending calm he always wore when he sensed a threat. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, voice syrupy, "but we don't deal in counterfeit anything." "That's a serious accusation." The man raised the report. "I have proof." These pads came apart after 3 weeks. The garage we went to compared them with factory originals. They're fake. Kyle took the report, glanced at it, and set it down without reading. "Sounds like you got scammed by the other shop trying to win your business. I'd be careful where you get second opinions." The woman stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We almost crashed. My daughter could have been killed." Kyle's expression didn't shift. "Well, maybe next time don't cheap out on a used car," he said, "or at least take better care of it." Silence fell over the service area. Every technician in the garage had stopped working, their eyes frozen on the scene beyond the glass. Greg saw Claire's hands shaking as she tried to speak, but Kyle cut her off with a raised hand. "I think we're done here," he said, turning back toward his office. "If you want to file a formal complaint, feel free, but don't expect a refund for parts we didn't install." The couple stood there stunned, unsure what to say. The man looked around the dealership, perhaps hoping anyone would step up, but no one did. Not yet. Not openly. Greg took a deep breath and turned toward the garage, only to see Marco quietly removing his gloves and walking toward the confrontation. "Mr. Bennett," Marco said, voice quiet but firm. "I remember that service I worked on that car and those pads. They didn't come from our regular supplier." Kyle froze. Slowly, he turned. "What did you just say?" Marco held his ground. "I said those parts weren't in the usual inventory." "I thought it was odd, but I didn't say anything at the time. I should have." There was a shift in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. Kyle's smile faded, replaced by something colder. "Come with me," he snapped. Now he didn't wait, just marched toward his office. Marco, trailing behind Greg, moved closer, careful to keep his expression neutral, but inside his blood was roaring. Through the thin drywall, Greg could hear everything. The office door wasn't fully shut. Kyle's voice was low and venomous. "You want to be a hero now," he spat. "You want to play the whistleblower." Marco said something Greg couldn't quite catch, but Kyle's response was crystal clear. "One word about those parts, and I will bury you. You think anyone's going to hire a guy with a record? You'll be flipping burgers by next week. I'll tell every shop in the city you're a liability. Don't test me." There was a pause. Then, the unmistakable sound of something slamming a fist, a file, maybe a drawer. "Now get back to work. And if you ever speak out again, you're done." A few minutes later, Marco emerged from the office, pale eyes on the floor. He walked past Greg without a word, back to his workstation, and picked up a torque wrench with a hand that visibly trembled. Greg followed him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "You all right?" he whispered. Marco nodded, but didn't look up. "He's not bluffing," he said. "He'll ruin me." Greg wanted to say something. Anything, but stopped himself. Not yet. Not here. What Marco needed wasn't promises. He needed protection, and Greg would make sure he got it. That evening, as the last cars rolled out of the garage and the sun dipped behind the row of buildings across the lot, Greg sat alone in the break room, staring at the worn table and the echo of Kyle's threats still ringing in his ears. This wasn't just a toxic manager anymore. This was criminal. He'd seen dishonesty before, even manipulation. But this was something else. A line had been crossed, one that put lives at risk, shattered trust, and shattered people. Kyle wasn't just cutting corners. He was building an empire on deception, fear, and silence. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Greg had been listening, watching, documenting. And this moment, this lie about brake pads, this threat against Marco, it would be the turning point. Greg stood, grabbed his notebook, and scribbled one sentence under a line of neatly catalogued evidence. No more waiting, because there's a difference between being patient and being complicit, and tomorrow the reckoning would begin. The silence in the garage after closing hours was different that night. It wasn't the usual stillness of tired machines and empty workstations. It was the calm before a storm, one that had been brewing behind Greg Walker's quiet eyes and slow steps for weeks. He stood alone by Bay 4, watching the last car pull out of the service lot, its red taillights disappearing into the dusk. He could still hear Mrs. Henderson's shaky voice, the crack in Marco's, when he whispered, "He'll ruin me." That morning's encounter with the young couple had been the final straw. The lies were no longer just harming reputations, they were endangering lives. And Greg, no, Thomas knew it was time. No more observing, no more gathering evidence. The curtain had to fall. Kyle Bennett's show was over. He stepped into the break room and pulled out a phone he hadn't touched in 3 weeks, the one still registered under his real name, sitting at the same table where Marco had once eaten in silence and Claire had whispered numbers that didn't add up. Thomas dialed a direct line to his general counsel. "Jordan," he said quietly, when the call connected, "we're moving forward. I have everything we need. Photos, recordings, witness statements, documents. And I'm not just talking about Kyle anymore. We've got a supply chain issue, potential collusion with regulators, and evidence of financial fraud." There was a pause on the other end. "You're sure?" Jordan asked. "Absolutely," Thomas replied. "Get the board ready. I want everyone in the loop, legal HR compliance. We do this clean by the book and all at once." Next, he called the one person he trusted most to execute this perfectly, Melissa. His longtime assistant didn't flinch when he told her the plan. Surprise inspection tomorrow. First thing in the morning, I want all senior executives on site, discreet transport, no press, no leaks, and bring the legal team. Everyone needs to be standing at that front door by 9:10 a.m. On the other end of the line, Melissa didn't ask why. She didn't need to. "Understood," she said. "Consider it." Done. Thomas leaned back in his chair and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't hiding anymore. He was preparing. That night, back in his modest rented apartment, Thomas opened the suitcase where he'd stashed everything. His notes, backup drives, duplicate files. He spent hours organizing every piece of evidence into folders marked by category: counterfeit parts, staff testimonies, financial misconduct, regulatory bribery. He printed out screenshots, burned recordings onto disks, and laid out photos with sticky notes indicating time, date, and subject. It looked more like an FBI case file than anything belonging to a car dealership, but this wasn't just about internal corruption. It was about principle. It was about rebuilding trust in a company that bore his name, his legacy. He wasn't just about to expose a bad employee. He was about to reassert what Miller Automotive stood for: integrity, transparency, and justice. As midnight approached, Thomas rehearsed what he would say. He visualized Kyle's reaction. He pictured the board members arriving in dark suits, briefcases in hand. He saw Claire's face when she realized someone had finally listened. He saw Marco no longer afraid to speak. He even imagined Mrs. Henderson safe in her car, smiling as she drove with peace of mind. The dealership had become a battlefield, and tomorrow it would become a courtroom, not one of lawyers and judges, but of truth, and the witnesses were ready. Before going to bed, Thomas texted Melissa one last time. Remind everyone, dress sharp, bring documents, be early. This isn't just an inspection, it's a reckoning. She replied with a simple checkmark emoji, and the word confirmed. He stared at the screen for a moment, then powered off the phone. The next day would change everything, not just for the employees of that dealership, but for the culture that had allowed a man like Kyle to thrive. And Thomas would no longer be Greg Walker, the overweight mechanic with a fake resume. Tomorrow he would be exactly who he was meant to be: the owner, the leader, and the man who never stopped believing that doing the right thing still mattered. The storm outside rolled in just before dawn. Thunder cracked in the distance as rain began to fall in sheets across the pavement of the dealership lot. Inside, the lights were still off. The air was thick with anticipation, as if even the building could sense that something was coming, and it was unmarked. Black SUVs would soon arrive. Executives would step out, umbrellas in hand, ready to see the truth for themselves. And Kyle Bennett, still asleep in blissful ignorance, had no idea that by the time he poured his first cup of coffee, the walls around him would already be crumbling. By the time the first raindrops splattered against the garage windows that morning, Kyle Bennett was already on edge. Something had changed. Files in his computer appeared slightly rearranged. A folder he swore was password protected had been accessed. Claire had been unusually quiet, and Marco wouldn't meet his eyes. Even Greg, the fat, slow-moving new hire who seemed to bumble through the simplest tasks, had started showing up early, staying late, always just a little too close to sensitive areas. Kyle's paranoia simmered just below the surface. He paced his office before the staff arrived, double-checking his computer logs and surveillance footage. Someone's poking around, he muttered to himself. Someone's sniffing where they shouldn't, but he couldn't figure out who. And worse, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, he was already too late to stop it. At 9:07 a.m., just as Kyle was preparing to head into the garage for his morning rounds, Claire appeared at the office door. Her face was pale. "There's a group of people in the parking lot," she said quietly. "Suits legal team. Executives." Kyle frowned, storming toward the front windows. What he saw made his stomach drop. A half-dozen black vehicles were forming a semicircle in front of the dealership. Figures stepped out, men and women in pressed suits, carrying briefcases, phones to their ears. The company's general counsel, the head of compliance, even a regional VP, all unannounced, all arriving together. His throat went dry. This wasn't a routine visit. This was an ambush. Why wasn't I told about this? He snapped at Claire, who simply shook her head, her expression unreadable. As Kyle scrambled to compose himself, brushing down his blazer and tightening his tie, the garage floor had gone eerily silent. Mechanics paused mid-repair. Claire stood frozen by her desk. Marco looked up from an engine block, brow furrowed. Everyone sensed something big was about to happen, but no one knew what. Then slowly another figure stepped through the side entrance from the employee hallway. Greg Walker, still in his grease-stained coveralls, still slightly hunched with his trademark slow gait, but there was something different in his stride now, something deliberate. His eyes were sharp, focused, and in one smooth motion, right there on the service floor in front of every technician, every advisor, and Kyle himself. Greg reached up and removed his thick-rimmed glasses. Then the beard came off. Then the prosthetics around his jawline, and finally, the weighted vest beneath the coveralls. What remained was not the sloppy, overweight mechanic they thought they knew, but Thomas Miller, the founder and CEO of Miller Automotive Group. The silence was thunderous. Kyle's face drained of color. Claire gasped. Marco dropped the wrench in his hand, the clang echoing across the garage. Dennis, the veteran mechanic, let out a long, low breath. For a few seconds, no one moved. Thomas stood tall in the middle of the service bay, no longer hiding, no longer watching from the shadows. "Good morning," he said calmly, voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had built everything they were standing in. "My name is Thomas Miller. Some of you may have known me by a different name these past few weeks. I came here undercover to see what was really happening in this dealership. And now—" I know Kyle tried to recover, stepping forward with a shaky grin. "Mr. Miller, I had no idea. This is a surprise, to say the least." Thomas didn't respond. He simply turned to the gathered executives now stepping into the garage. "Please bring in the files," he instructed Melissa. His assistant appeared with a leather-bound folder and began handing out copies of the evidence. Photos, documents, transcripts, recordings. The truth, printed in black and white. Thomas faced the employees. This place was supposed to be the heart of our company, but instead it became a place where people were threatened, where customers were exploited, and where lies replaced leadership. And it ends today. Kyle's mask cracked. "This is insane," he said, laughing nervously. "You have no proof. This is all just a setup." He's lying." But Thomas turned to Claire. "Would you like to share the backup spreadsheets?" She nodded and handed over a flash drive. Then he looked to Marco, and the messages. Marco stepped forward, placing his phone gently on the table, open to a thread of threatening texts. Slowly, the other employees followed suit. Dennis, Claire, even junior mechanics, each producing some small piece of truth they had been too afraid to share. Now finally they could breathe. Kyle looked around the room, suddenly very alone. The empire he had ruled with fear and arrogance was collapsing in real time, and the man he had mocked for weeks now stood at the center of it all, unmasked, unyielding, and backed by a mountain of truth. "You don't have the authority," Kyle began, but Thomas cut him off. "You never had it," he said. "You only borrowed it until we noticed what you were doing. And now we have your time. Here is over." As security approached, Kyle's shoulders slumped. The performance was over. The mask was off, and the man who had built this company from nothing had just reclaimed its soul. For a long moment, the garage remained suspended in silence. Time itself seemed to stall. Kyle Bennett stood frozen, surrounded not only by his stunned employees, but also by an army of executives, legal advisors, and HR personnel who had just witnessed the unmasking of the CEO. His face twitched as he scanned the room for a sympathetic expression, a loyal nod, a single soul who might still defend him. But no one stepped forward. The atmosphere had shifted. His power had evaporated the moment Thomas Miller revealed himself. Now the fear that had long hovered over the garage floor was being replaced with something new: liberation. It started slowly. Claire stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice firm. "I have everything," she said. "Every manipulated invoice, every altered spreadsheet, every service that never happened, but got billed anyway." She handed a thick folder to Amanda Liu, the head of legal, who began flipping through its contents. Next came Marco, still quiet but steadier than before. "I saved the texts," he said. "From the day Kyle threatened to fire me if I took my sister to her chemo appointment. The ones where he said he'd ruin me if I spoke up." He placed his phone on the nearby cart, open to a message thread full of threats and intimidation. Around them, other employees began moving. Dennis retrieved a binder from his locker. Two younger techs offered to forward photos of counterfeit parts they had been asked to install, and even a shy receptionist from the front desk revealed a USB drive full of recorded audio from morning meetings. Kyle's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're all turning on me," he barked. "After everything I've done to make this location #1, I carried this place. I made it profitable." He gestured toward the executives. "They don't care about you. I was the only one who." Thomas raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The calm in his voice only made his words hit harder. "You didn't carry anything, Kyle. You buried it. You buried trust ethics and every ounce of dignity this shop once had. You bullied people into silence, forged reports to inflate your numbers, and used fear as a management tool. That's not leadership. That's exploitation." Kyle's demeanor changed. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by desperation. "This isn't fair. You don't know what it's like trying to keep margins up with impossible targets." I had no choice. Amanda stepped in, holding up Claire's documents and a printed transcript of a phone call. "You had every choice, and you made the wrong ones. Repeatedly, we have proof of financial fraud, employee harassment, falsified safety reports, and supplier kickbacks. This isn't just an internal issue, Mr. Bennett. This is a criminal one." Kyle turned pale. "Wait, just wait. If we talk this through, I can explain." He stumbled, reaching for any thread of control, but Thomas had heard enough. He turned to the two security officers standing near the entrance escort. "Mr. Bennett, to the conference room. The authorities will want to speak with him shortly." As the guards approached, Kyle stepped back. "No, you can't. This is entrapment. I'll sue. I'll take you all down with me." He flailed, voice rising, but no one listened. The employees he had once controlled now stood with their arms crossed, watching him with unflinching eyes. Marco, who had once cowered under Kyle's threats, looked directly at him, no longer afraid. As Kyle was led away, a final voice rose from the crowd. It was Claire. "You didn't just steal money, Kyle," she said. "You stole people's peace, their sense of purpose. But not anymore." The room remained quiet, heavy, with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Thomas stepped forward once more, meeting the eyes of every person present. "You've all been through more than anyone should have to endure at work, but that ends now. I promise you this place is going to become what it was always meant to be, a company that puts people first, and no one will ever treat you like that again." Rain tapped gently against the garage roof as Kyle disappeared down the hallway, his empire of lies crumbling behind him. For the first time in years, the service bay didn't feel suffocating. It felt open, like the beginning of something new. And in the stillness that followed, Thomas knew this wasn't just a takedown. It was a turning point. The truth had been unmasked, and justice had finally walked through the door. The days following Kyle Bennett's removal were unlike anything the staff at Miller Automotive's flagship location had ever experienced. The air felt lighter, as if the very walls had exhaled. There was no more yelling across the garage, no more silent glances of fear. In its place came something both unfamiliar and long-forgotten hope. For Thomas Miller, it wasn't just about removing the problem. It was about restoring what had been lost, dignity, trust, and the moral compass that had guided the company from the beginning. His first act was simple yet powerful. Every single customer who had been overcharged, misled, or defrauded under Kyle's management received a full refund with interest. Personalized apology letters were mailed, signed by Thomas himself. For customers who had incurred repair costs elsewhere due to Kyle's actions, the company covered them in full. "It's not just about making it right," he told the legal team. "It's about showing them we remember who we are." Inside the garage, the change was just as swift. In a company-wide meeting held beneath the flickering lights of the now-repaired break room, Thomas stood before the team no longer as an undercover boss, but as the man who had built their careers, their futures, their second chances. He announced that all employees who had endured Kyle's abuse and still remained committed to their work would receive bonuses retroactive to the date Kyle had taken over. It wasn't just a financial gesture, it was an acknowledgement of their resilience. Claire's eyes welled up as she held her bonus check in trembling hands. Dennis chuckled and said it was the first time in years he'd actually feel good cashing a company envelope, and Marco quiet loyal. Marco received not just a bonus, but something more, a promotion. Effective immediately, Thomas said, Marco Reyes is the new service manager for this location. The announcement was met with a wave of applause. Marco stood stunned, hands shaking slightly, eyes darting toward his co-workers as if to make sure he had heard correctly. Thomas smiled. You've shown character in the darkest moments, integrity when it would have been easier to stay silent. That's what leadership looks like. Marco nodded slowly, and for the first time since Thomas met him, he stood fully upright, taller, prouder, ready. Dennis, who had quietly spoken of retirement for months, made a different choice. I'll stick around a while longer, he told Thomas. Can't walk away now. Not when the kids need someone to teach them the right way to do this job. Within the week, he began mentoring new hires, teaching not just torque specs and diagnostics, but patience pride and how to treat every customer like they mattered. A new apprenticeship program was rolled out, and Dennis became the heartbeat of it. The garage that had once echoed with fear now rang with laughter, questions and collaborative problem-solving. Instead of huddled silence during lunch breaks, employees sat together, shared meals, swapped stories. Claire even organized a customer thank you wall where long-time clients could send in photos and notes, now proudly displayed near the service desk. It wasn't just morale that improved, it was performance. With pressure lifted, mechanics worked more thoroughly, customers returned in higher numbers, and service satisfaction surveys reached record highs. Even Thomas was surprised at the speed of the transformation. Turns out, he remarked during a company update, when you treat people like human beings instead of metrics, they tend to show up with more than just their hands, they bring their heart. That sentiment became the dealership's new mantra. Posters were updated, the employee handbook was revised, but more importantly, the culture itself changed. People began trusting each other again. Problems were brought forward without fear, mistakes were acknowledged without punishment, and every win, big or small, was celebrated. Thomas didn't fade into the background either. He returned to the dealership weekly, not as a distant executive, but as a mentor, a presence, a listener. He walked the shop floor, took time to greet new hires, asked about families, and made it clear he wasn't just watching the numbers, he was watching the people. His undercover experience had taught him something invaluable. The strongest businesses aren't built on margins and marketing, they're built on values. And as he looked around at the garage that had once nearly collapsed under corruption, but now stood firm in unity, he knew the hardest part was over. The rebuild had begun, not with tools or budgets, but with truth, and this time everyone had a hand in it. 6 months had passed since the storm, not the one that rolled in the morning. Thomas Miller unmasked himself, but the one that had raged quietly inside Miller Automotive's flagship dealership. Years of mistrust, fear and silence now washed away by truth, accountability, and the decision to rebuild. From the outside, the dealership still looked much the same. Same glass-paneled showroom, same red and white branding above the bay doors. But step inside and you could feel it. Something was different. The air held laughter. Customers were greeted by name. Mechanics took the time to explain repairs instead of rushing through them. The break room, once a silent sanctuary for the overworked and overlooked, now buzzed with friendly chatter, group lunches, and even birthday celebrations. The toxic culture that had once seeped into every corner had been replaced with something rare in the world of business genuine care. News of the transformation spread quickly. Industry publications published articles titled The Garage That Came Back from the Brink and How One CEO's Undercover Mission. Redefined leadership dealerships across the country reached out to learn from the Miller Auto model how they had restructured service protocols, implemented ethical training, and created open-door policies for employees at all levels. Regional managers were flown in for on-site walkthroughs. HR departments adopted Miller's post-crisis playbook as a national template for culture repair. What had once been the company's most damaged location had become its proudest proof that even the deepest cracks could be filled if you built back with integrity. At the center of it all stood Marco Reyes. He had taken to his role as service manager with quiet discipline and a deep sense of purpose, but his natural leadership didn't go unnoticed. He'd started employee-led workshops on technical certifications, launched a mentorship circle for newer hires, and even partnered with local high schools to build a recruitment pipeline. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but his presence grounded the entire shop. When customers had questions they asked for Marco. When employees needed advice, they came to his door. When mistakes happened, and they still did, he didn't point fingers, he listened, learned, and led. So when the time came to appoint a new general manager for the location, there was no debate. Thomas called a staff meeting, stood beside Marco, and made it official. Today, Thomas said with a proud smile, we don't just reward hard work, we recognize heart. Marco Reyes has shown more courage, humility, and integrity than any leadership course could ever teach. He's not just the manager this dealership needs. He's the leader it deserves. The room erupted in applause. Claire wiped away a tear. Dennis clapped harder than anyone. Marco, stunned but deeply moved, nodded and said only one thing, I won't let you down, and everyone in that room believed it. Thomas watched from a quiet corner, arms crossed, a rare softness in his expression. He had seen so many milestones in his career, the first dealership, ribbon-cutting the day. Miller Automotive expanded to 3 states the moment they hit their billion-dollar revenue goal. But this was different. This wasn't about numbers. This was about redemption, about people, about the soul of a business being pulled back from the edge, not by policy or profits, but by individuals who refused to surrender their values, even when it would have been easier to give in. He thought back to the moment he had put on the padded suit and became Greg Walker. It had been a gamble, a risk, but it had brought him face to face with a truth that too many CEOs forget. The higher you rise, the easier it becomes to stop listening. And when you stop listening, you stop leading. Back in his office, the one that used to belong to Kyle Marco had cleared out every last reminder of the past. Gone were the luxury watches and designer pens. In their place stood photos of his sister smiling after her last treatment, a plaque made by the apprentices thanking him for his mentorship, and a quote Thomas had given him on his first day as manager. Now framed beside the computer, integrity doesn't shout, it shows up every day and does the work. Thomas smiled when he saw it. That single quote now defined the dealership more than any mission statement ever could. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the service floor, Thomas took one last walk through the garage. He passed Dennis patiently teaching a trainee how to calibrate sensors. He waved at Claire, now revitalized and running customer service like a captain at the helm. He spotted Marco outside giving a tour to a group of high school students and speaking passionately about opportunity and second chances. Thomas paused for a moment and let the sound of this new chapter wash over him. It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, but it was right. This was success, not the kind written in quarterly reports, but the kind that lived in people's stories, in quiet resilience, and in earned trust. He turned toward the exit, breathing deeply, not with the weight of responsibility, but with the peace that comes from knowing the right people are in place. As he reached for the door, he whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, let this be the future not just for Miller Auto, but for every business that's forgotten what people are worth. And with that, he stepped outside into the evening light, leaving behind a place no longer broken, but reborn. If this story moved, you imagine how many others need to hear it. Deep inside HQ, we believe that real leadership starts when the truth is no longer optional and when everyday people choose courage over comfort. If you've ever witnessed injustice in the workplace or felt the power of one person standing up for what's right, this is your community. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories that expose, inspire, and empower. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that dignity at work isn't a privilege. It's a right. And leave a comment below. Your voice might be the spark someone else needs to speak up.